Hello, everyone. This is the video lecture for Chapter 5 in the Aker's textbook. This chapter discusses social learning theory. So in criminology, when we talk about social learning theories, it generally refers to the theory of crime and deviance, developed by Ronald Akers. And as you recall, this textbook is also written by Ronald Akers. He originally proposed this while working with Robert Burgess, and it's essentially a reformulation of differential association theory. So if you recall differential association theory, this is Sutherland's theory where he talks about how crime is a learned behavior. We learn both the techniques and motivations for committing crimes through close, intimate, personal interactions with people. So this theory, social learning theory, is a general theory and it's applied to a wide range of behaviors. It's a theory that has been tested extensively, and it's a very it's a well-endorsed theory, so a lot of criminologists and researchers like this theory. So let's start with a review of Sutherland's differential association theory. This is one of my favorite theories. It has 9 tenets to it, and while the last few can be a little bit confusing, if you think about the theory as a whole, it makes a lot of sense. So Sutherland is a criminologist from the 20th century, and he's probably the most important criminologist in that time period. He's the person who coins the term white-collar crime, and he wrote about that quite a bit. So he looked at he did some research on professional theft and white-collar crime. His textbook was the leading crim textbook for over 30 years, and that's the only place he actually wrote about differential association theory. So it's not a theory that's been published in a peer-reviewed journal. He wrote about it in his textbook. So there's 9 tenets of this, and some of these you can sort of sum up together. So criminal behavior is learned. We learn that through interacting with other people, and generally this occurs in close, intimate, personal groups. Not only do you learn how to commit the behavior, but you would also learn why you might want to do it, what are your attitudes towards it, and how you could rationalize that behavior as well. This is where it starts to get a little trickier. Okay, so the first 5 tenets are pretty straightforward. The middle ones are a little more challenging, and the last few are the most challenging. So basically, we have definitions of various laws, or the law in general, and we see the law either as a favorable thing or an unfavorable thing. Okay, most of you guys, as crim majors, CJ majors, probably view the law as a favorable thing. Okay, even in general, when you have some concerns or critiques, or you take issue with some aspects of the law, in general, you probably wouldn't be pursuing this field if you saw the law as unfavorable. The more unfavorable definitions we have of crime, the more likely we are to engage in crime. So then here's where it starts to get a little trickier. So in his theory, he talks about differential association. Okay? These differential associations vary in frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. So essentially, the relationships we have with other people where we learn this behavior, some are more important than others, some are reinforced more often, some are more intense, some have lasted longer, and some are more frequent. So if you think about your friendships, right, there's some people you've known a long time. Those aren't necessarily the most important relationships in your life. They might not be the people you see the most. So those are factors, that are going to impact the decisions that we make. Someone also points out that crime is learned the same way all other behavior is learned. So, we didn't invent crime. We learn it the same way we learn how to do anything else. And finally, he wraps up by noting that crime is an expression of our wants and needs. I want something you have, or I need something you have, so I'm going to steal it from you. But non-criminal behavior is an expression of those wants and needs as well. So you might also want these same things or need these same things as I do, but you might choose to earn them appropriately. So those wants and needs are not sufficient to explain criminal behavior. We can't just say criminal behavior happens. People steal steal iPads because they want an iPad. There's many people who want an iPad who, excuse me, don't steal it. They save up, they buy it, they finance it, whatever method they choose. So that sixth statement, that principle of differential association. Let's talk about this a little bit more. A person commits criminal acts because they've learned definitions of the law, attitudes towards it, the way we rationalize our behavior, favorable to violating the law, okay? And that we have more definitions of that than we have definitions of the law that are pro-social. So the rationalizations or attitudes towards law violation are greater than those that are against it. Our exposure to others' definitions, right? So where do you learn that maybe, when you're young, you learn that drugs are bad, right? Drugs are bad, smoking is bad, drinking is bad. How do you decide later on that perhaps these things aren't as bad? Someone would have to expose you to that idea, okay? So our exposure to other people's views of the law, right, their definition, is balanced against, definitions favorable to law violation are balanced against conforming definitions. It's simply not a matter of either criminal or non-criminal association. When we think about what's most important, the things we're exposed to first, more frequently, for longer periods of time, and with greater intensity, are more likely to impact us. After Sutherland dies, Cressy revises the text for the 5th through 10th editions and kept Sutherland's theory intact. Cressy clarified it, applied it to some different areas, and occasionally included differential association as something that is, a social learning-based theory. Luckenbill also edited the text, that should say text, not test, but didn't change Sutherland's proposition. So the most thorough and tested version of Sutherland is Aker's social learning theory. So let's talk about Aker's. Sutherland's 8th statement, right, his 8th tenet, his 8th proposition, says that we learn criminal behavior the same way we learn any other behavior, right? So how do you learn how to tie your shoes, right? Someone shows it to you, they demonstrate it to you, they explain it to you, you practice it. But he doesn't, so he says it's the same as learning anything else, but he doesn't really explain that process of learning, okay? Burgess and Aker write a theory they refer to as Differential Association Reinforcement theory, and they're attempting to explain the processes by which we would actually learn this behavior. So essentially, they're taking differential association theory, and then they're putting in some social learning principles. And you guys may be familiar with some of this stuff from psychology as well. So how do we learn behavior? So they're taking, Burgess and Aker are taking Sutherland's theory, and they're trying to explain the 8th proposition, and they're doing so using operant and respondent conditioning. Okay? Aker later follows this up and develops what's sort of a broader theory, social learning theory. So differential association is a type of social learning theory. Burgess and Aker have expanded upon it. Social learning is not competitive with differential association theory. Just social learning explains it more. So again, if you think about the fact that Sutherland sort of just throws out this proposition that we learn crime the same way we learn any other behavior, but he doesn't explain how we learn. Okay? So Burgess and Aker are just defining those mechanisms. These mechanisms, these concepts include differential reinforcement, okay, and this is how our voluntary behavior is conditioned or shaped by rewards and punishments. So think back to when you were a little kid, okay? Maybe you had chores you had to do, and maybe your parents rewarded you for doing that. Maybe you had parents who, based on your report card, gave you certain rewards, right? As we get older, we're not praised for everything we do when we do it. If you guys can imagine every single time one of you guys, participated well in class, if I stopped and pointed it out every single time, or I said, good job raising your hand, good job speaking out, we'd be in class all day just congratulating each other. As we get older too, we also sort of internalize these behaviors, and we do them for other reasons. Okay? To give you rewards or punishments, there was a time when my mom and my sister both told my brother that if he got all A's in his report card, I think they had both told him they'd give him $100. So they both told him they'd give him $50. Or actually, you know what it was? They told him they'd give him a certain amount per A. So that's that quarter. My brother sat down, he buckled down, and he got all A's. And both my mom and my sister had to pay him out. I think they each ended up having to pay him like $100. So maybe they offered him $20 per A. So obviously, this could be, a huge motivator for people, right? If I gave you guys, $1 every time you participated in class, you guys are great at this anyway, but you probably participate even more. We also condition our involuntary behavior. So this is classical or respondent conditioning. They also talk about discriminative stimuli. So there's things in our environment that provide cues or signals for us for our behavior. If you guys think about something that may have been talked about in deviance in the past, certainly if you've had me, we talked about this, is that, think about when you start a new job, right? At first, you don't know the culture, you don't know the rules at your new job. We all tend to maybe, if we haven't been given some specifics about the dress code, well, I'm going to overdress a little bit today, right? And then we sort of learn the rules. We see the cues in the environment. Okay, how is everybody else dressing? How long of a break do people take for lunch? Do people eat lunch at their desk? Do they go out for lunch? And then it also takes into account things like how often we're reinforced, right? So little kids, think about if you guys have ever babysat, you have nieces or nephews, younger siblings, with enough of an age difference for you to recall this. You think about when little kids are learning words or they're learning how to do something, right? Maybe they're learning how to feed themselves, they're learning how to walk. You reinforce their behavior every time they do it, okay? If you've got a kid where you're really working with them on making sure they say please and thank you, every time they do it, initially you're like, great job, nice manners. We don't do this anymore, right? When's the last time your parents pointed out to you that you had nice manners, right? They probably expect this of you. So reinforcement doesn't have to be constant in order to be effective, right? Think about now as the type of student you are now in college. Are you reinforced every single time you do something that is good for your academic career or good for your grades? No, you're reinforced with grades. Sometimes someone pulls you aside and says, wow, it's really great work on this. So social learning theory still has that strong elements from differential association theory. They talk about how we interact with other people is really the main way that we gain meaning or understand symbols. So one thing that we have the ability to do is put ourselves in someone else's shoes, right? Put ourselves in someone else's role, and we're able to sort of incorporate that into how we see ourselves. So some central concepts and propositions of social learning theory. This basically embraces variables or concepts that operate not only to motivate and control criminal behavior, but also to promote and undermine conforming behavior as well. So we can learn conforming behavior, which most of you have learned, which is the key to your success. So the probability of crime occurring then is part of function of how we balance these influences based on our learning history. Okay, so we've had plenty of people give us messages or talk to us about why illegal or criminal or deviant behavior might be okay, as well as pro-social conforming law-abiding behavior. So likelihood of committing crimes increase when we differentially associate with people who commit crime. The more friends you have who commit crime, the more important these people are to you, the more priority you give to those relationships. I mean, that just makes sense, right? That you would be more likely to engage in those behaviors. Maybe you wanted to be, a badass, deviant, criminal kid, but you didn't have any friends who behaved that way. It's going to make it much more difficult for you to do that. It also has to do with how much we associate with people who have definitions of the law that are favorable to law violations. This defines certain things as desirable or justified in a situation. So some people grow up in communities where not only are you sort of told, oh, it's okay to hit somebody under certain circumstances, you might have been told that's the only appropriate response. It also depends been rewarded or punished for behavior in the past, and that sort of predicts how much we anticipate getting in trouble or being rewarded for something in the future. So Aker has relied on four main components. Again, he looked at these definitions, right, of things, but he talked about differential association, but he also talks about differential reinforcement, the way we're reinforced differently for behavior, and imitation. So differential association has normative dimensions and behavioral interactional dimensions. Let's look at what this means. An interactional dimension is our direct association with other people. What kind of behavior do they engage in? And indirect associations we have and identifications we have with reference groups. Reference groups are groups you might want to join. So I think we talked about this in class, maybe in our second week of class, where we talked about how your future career might impact your behavior, right? So many of you want to go into law enforcement. You obviously want to go into some type of criminal justice field. So you start to identify with that. If you want to go into the FBI, the DEA, or local policing, you use them as a reference group, and you think about your behavior in reference to the fact that you'd like to be a member of that group one day. And that changes your behavior. So when I was in college, I had some roommates who decided they wanted to try smoking marijuana. And at the time, I was in the process of applying for the Federal Marshal Service. I was pretty sure that's what I was going to do for my career. And I was horrified that they would bring this into the apartment, that they could potentially get us in trouble, not only at the college, and that could impact my future. So I knew that I wanted to do something in law enforcement or do something in criminal justice field, and I thought, these people are jeopardizing that for me. So I would conform my behavior to reference groups, groups that I thought I'd be a part of one day. Norms and values also play a role here, right? So we're exposed to different norms and values. These differ depending on where you grow up, the type of community you live in, and again, the people you're exposed to. So the people with whom we interact provide social context for us. They expose us to definitions, of the law as favorable or unfavorable. They are models for us to imitate. So when I was deciding, which obviously I did not end up employed by the Federal Marshal Service, I chose not to pursue that in the end. But both my uncle, that was his lifelong career, and my aunt was a federal marshal when I was young. And she was someone I really looked up to and admired. She retired from the Marshal Service early on because when they decided to have a family, they didn't want both the mother and the father working in a potentially dangerous career. It still had a strong impact on me because this was a relationship where I really admired my aunt and my uncle, and they played a big role in my life. And those were intense, important relationships to me. So it really impacted, my behavior and how I saw things. So the people who are most impactful for us, we have primary groups. This is your family, your friends, the people you spend, most of your time with, whose opinions really matter to you. And then we have secondary groups. These can be neighbors, churches you belong to, teachers. Even if you guys think of, as you guys have gotten and become upperclassmen, juniors and seniors in the PJ program, we're a smaller group than you are when you're freshmen. Right? Some people don't pursue the bachelor's degree, some people drop out of school, but you guys are a close-knit group. You might define that as a primary group, depending on how much time you spend with your friends that are also in the PJ program, or it might be a really influential secondary group for you. We also have virtual peer groups, right? So this is the media, people we know on the internet. So the associations that occur earliest, last longer, occupy more time, these have stronger effects on us. So if you think about, how I described my relationship with my aunt and uncle, those were people who were really impactful on me because, they've been in my life pretty much my whole life. And they're people that, opinion really matters to me and I spend a lot of time with. Neither one of them sort of set out to influence my career choice. And in fact, I think when I told my uncle that I was going to apply in this field, he was, it wasn't totally surprised, but it wasn't something where he was like, oh, I knew this was coming. So definitions are attitudes and meanings we attach to behavior. So if you think about when we've talked before about laws that we think maybe shouldn't be laws, right? We have different meanings, symbolism, values we place on certain behaviors. So there's some behavior we all probably pretty strongly agree upon, that these are things that should be illegal and they should be handled a certain way. And then there's other things we have disagreement on or we just don't feel are as important. Okay? So that's really, how we define these behaviors really matters. You might also find that some people who've worked in law enforcement for a long time take a really staunch view on right and wrong. Things are illegal, therefore you don't do them. They might not, take as much of the sort of gray area. We also have general beliefs. These are religious, moral norms that favor conforming behavior, pro-social behavior, law-abiding behavior. These do change over our lifetime. Again, the younger you are, the more you sort of are black and white about right and wrong. And then we have specific definitions. So normally we think it's wrong to steal, but there may be circumstances under which we can justify that behavior. We might feel it's okay to smoke marijuana and rationalize that it's okay to violate laws against drug possession. The more attitudes we hold that disapprove of certain behavior, the less likely we are to commit that behavior. The more we approve of the behavior, the more likely we are to actually engage in that behavior. So basically, the way we look at definitions are we're either positive about them, we find it to be good behavior, we wholly advocate for that behavior, or neutral, we favor the commission of a crime by justifying or excusing it. I think we might have talked about, or maybe we talked about it in ethics. There are times where it's okay to hit somebody. And so generally most of us agree, committing battery against somebody is wrong, but there's circumstances under which we feel we could justify that behavior, right? Certainly to defend ourselves, certainly to defend someone else. There might even be times where you sort of see it as, well, that guy deserves it. Do you guys remember talking about techniques of neutralization? And I think somebody is presenting on this, so I'm not going to cover it in too much depth. But these are ways we sort of neutralize the bad feelings we have. So just because we think a behavior is wrong, how do we justify it when we commit it? Right? So a common one for college students, right, is like, oh, I was drunk. You know how I get when I drink this? Right? Or you know how I get when I'm out with my friends? The way we define things develops through how that behavior is reinforced for us and imitating other people. Some definitions are so intensely held they require us to violate the law. So you think about sort of these, we haven't seen too much of this, in recent time, but there was a period where we had a lot of militias, and they were stockpiling weapons, and, engaging in some behavior that violated the law. But they really believed, they didn't recognize, the government of the United States, and they believed their behavior to be, they held these beliefs so intensely that they thought this behavior was okay. But most definitions favorable to crime are not ones where we're saying, like, yes, I am pro-hitting people, right? It's more that we have a belief that's sort of weak, and so it's easier for us to violate that. Differential reinforcement, and this is how we balance anticipated versus actual rewards and punishments, right? So refraining from crime depends on past, present, and anticipated rewards or punishments. Have you done this before? Have you gotten in trouble for it? Have you gotten away with it? Did you like the rewards? So we have both positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. I just want to check before I define these, see if I have a chart on the next page. But okay. So positive reinforcement is your behavior is reinforced, right? You get a reward, and so you increase the likelihood of doing that act. Negative reinforcement is when you're allowed to escape any unpleasant consequences. Punishment can be positive, right? We introduce a painful consequence, or it can be negative when we take away something. So I think that sort of that concept of negative punishment is one that's used with children a lot, right? So you take something away from them. My mom would sort of take away from my brother, his PlayStation or, something that was important to him. The greater the amount of reinforcement or the greater value of the reinforcement, the more frequently it's reinforced, the higher probability it is that it will be reinforced. That leads to us repeating that behavior. Okay? These don't have to be actual physical rewards. It can be non-social. It can be intrinsic. So something that reinforces drug use is that initially drug use feels good, right? Why do people drink to excess, or why do people get high? At least in the beginning, it has to feel good, or you wouldn't do it, right? Or you wouldn't do it again. How we perceive these things depends upon our previous experiences as well. So some people maybe you've even been on like prescription medication and had an experience where you didn't really like the way the medication made you feel, and you think to yourself, oh my God, I don't think I could like abuse drugs because I really didn't enjoy that feeling. Sometimes people define that feeling as positive for you. And I've read some research that talks about this being true for some opiate use. That for some people, their initial use of heroin made them violently ill, but other people who use define that as a positive experience for them. So this, again, reinforcement and punishment can include actual tangible and intangible rewards. Some are symbolic, and even things that are tangible can be symbolic. So money or material possessions we gain, they might also be symbols of prestige or the ability to afford something. We also reinforce our own behavior. This is how we exercise our own self-control. We reinforce or punish our own behavior. You may have said to yourself, and I don't know how common this is with guys, so let's talk about this in class. Guys, remind me to bring this up. But girls, you may have said things to yourself like, okay, maybe there's a purse you really want, or there's an outfit you really want, and you say to yourself, oh, I'll let myself buy that when I finish X, Y, Z. Right? Like, you're going to reward yourself for something. We also engage in behavior after observing other people engage in that behavior. Whether or not we copy that depends on who the person is we're copying, right? What are their characteristics? What behavior are we seeing? And what consequences are we seeing? So this is, I had a client once who told me, he had been involved in drug dealing, and he had a cousin who was a drug dealer, and the cousin would say to him repeatedly, don't get involved in dealing drugs, it's bad, you shouldn't do this. And I think he meant well, passing that message on to his younger cousin. But the younger cousin saw that the older cousin, who was already dealing drugs, had nice clothes and money in his pocket, and he was always able to eat when he was hungry. And that message was much stronger for him than the don't do what I'm doing message. And, really said to him, like, look, you can have all these things too. And that is both a tangible reward, but also it's an intrinsic reward or symbolic reward, because when you have expensive things and people recognize the label or the designer, you're signaling to people, look, I can afford this item. Right? You're saying something about your social class. You're saying something about achievements you might have had. So this is a complex process, right? So we have rewards and behaviors reinforced, and there's feedback that we get. So after we initiate this behavior, social and non-social reinforcers and punishments affect whether we'll repeat it. They also then affect how we see things. So again, think back to when you were a young kid and you thought, I can vividly remember coming home from school and telling my grandmother one day, like, oh, I must have learned that something about smoking in school. And I was like, I've never smoked cigarettes. Cigarettes are terrible. And then, I got older and some friends exposed me to cigarettes, and I'm not a smoker, but I've smoked a cigarette before. And I redefined the behavior as not so problematic, right? So once you have an experience with it, I think smoking is disgusting, but I don't have the same hard line about it that I had when I was a child, and I had a very black and white view of it. Whether an act is committed depends also when an opportunity is present, what our past learning behavior has been, and what reinforcers exist. Crime can occur in the absence of any thought given to right and wrong. Definitions are also applied to people retroactively to justify past behavior. So sometimes we might have engaged in a behavior and we thought it was wrong, and as we change our definition of that, we go back and apply it in the past, like, oh, it wasn't that bad that I did that, because that's not really bad behavior. If this mitigates our punishment, then we use these as cues to repeat that behavior. So initially, the justification might be used retroactively, right? We turn around and we apply it to something in the past, and then we use that to allow us to engage in that behavior in the future. Differential association precedes the commission of crimes. Families are included in this process. Families can model bad behavior and good behavior for kids. And parents also supervise and control who your friends are when you're young. Similarity amongst behaviors of a peer group also play a role too in how children select friends. So initial friendships usually form around attractions and locations, not the fact people don't usually initially self-select friends because those friends are engaging in delinquent behavior. Think about when you're a kid, where do you first make your friends, right? At school, on any sports teams or extracurricular activities you're involved in. When you're a child, it's not like you can seek out, you can say like, oh, I eventually want to become a member of this group. I'm going to join them and make some friends there. Deviant peers, however, reinforce each other, right? They help each other justify and excuse their behavior. So if you're engaging in deviant behavior, peers who maximize those payoffs are going to be the peers you choose. So this theory proposes that deviant association precedes delinquent behavior more often than the delinquency starts and you choose delinquent friends. So what about social structure and how that impacts social learning? Aker proposed a model in which social structures are believed to indirectly affect our behavior. They affect the variables that impact our social learning. So they impact our differential association, reinforcement, etc. So they impact social learning variables, which in turn impacts whether or not we engage in delinquent behavior. So they identify 4 dimensions to social structure. Right, so one is differential social organization. So how communities are organized. Some correlates of crime are impacted by that. So what's the age makeup of a community? We know that certain ages are more likely to be crime prone. So probably from like early to mid-teens to early to mid-20s. The more people of that age you have in a community, how densely populated is an area. So that's really looking at characteristics of communities and how that might impact crime rates. Socio-demographic characteristics. So what's your location in social class and social standing and social structure? Your gender, your race, ethnicity, your marital status. Age plays a role here as well. What does theory really tell us? Enemy, a state of normlessness, oppression, social disorganization, and then membership in and relationships to our primary, secondary, and reference groups. So the first 2, right, we got that social organization and differential location, provides a general learning context. So what community do you live in and how is that impacting what you're exposed to and what you can potentially learn. Differences in social groups provide socialization, learning environments for us. And then structural conditions affect our exposure to criminal role models, criminal definitions. Okay, so that's sort of the theory, right? If we were to study this theory, how empirically valid is it? So they've looked at the research, they've done some research on the relationship of criminal and delinquent behavior to these social learning variables. The preponderance of the evidence, right? So this is more evidence points to this than does not point to it. Find strong relationships, and the hypotheses here are generally upheld. There's not much negative evidence here. So Pratt and Cullen conducted what's called a meta-analysis. This is where you go back and you look at all the research that other people have done, and you reanalyze it in a massive study. Pratt and Cullen both found support for social learning variables, both for differential association and definition. It didn't have a stronger effect than self-control, but when tested against other theories, they have more support for this theory than they do for other theories. They've also looked at social learning in terms of family, right? Some things that make a difference here are family structure. What does your family look like? Okay, are there 2 parents at home? Is it a single parent? Are there no parents? This is not, I just want to say, this is not an indictment of single-parent homes. What this is reflective of is your family structure impacts how much supervision you have. So you could have a 2-parent household, and if both parents are not home often, they're working a lot, they're not providing a lot of structure, that can be just as damaging and create the same sort of situation for deviance as a single-parent home. A single-parent home might be providing more supervision. Maybe you don't live with your parents, you live, with grandparents, and they provide better social structure. Our family exposes us, right? So most of your values are probably similar to your family, right? Your family has acted as role models for you. They reinforce your behavior. So family normally socializes us for conventional, law-abiding, pro-social behavior. Deviant behavior can be the outcome of internal family interactions. So if your parents are deviant and they're acting as socializers, you're more likely to be deviant. If your parents are too strict with punishment, if they're erratic, if they punish you for minor things and let you get away with really big things, they might expose you to negative values as well. Parents who remain in control of their children while being supportive and sensitive, that's sort of the best recipe for raising a child. So you want to make sure you're aware of what your kids are up to, where they are, what they're doing, who they're socializing with, but you also need to be supportive and sensitive to them. So you really want to balance this, this fine line there. Ineffective discipline increases the chances kids will learn early on, behavior early on that, sort of predictive of delinquent behavior. So if you consistently make use of rewards for good behavior and appropriate negative consequences for misbehavior, kids generally learn conformity that way. Sometimes parents directly train their kids to commit deviant behavior. Kids also influence the parents too. If you have a really difficult child, and I don't mean like, this kid's challenging, like a kid that really has problematic behavior, that can influence your parenting as well. Research that looks at peers. Peers are probably the best predictor of our delinquent behavior. Parents impact your choice of friends, right? You might have had people you wanted to hang out with that your parents wouldn't let you hang out with. Siblings are also, in a way, peer effects, depending on how old your siblings are. So maybe your family's very pro-social, but you're hanging around with a group of kids that are not as pro-social. Okay, so there's different social networks that sort of impact this. We have a cohesion network; these are the people we have direct communication with regularly, and what's called a structural equivalence network. So people who occupy sort of the same level in us. So teenagers identify with other teens even if they don't know them that well, more than they identify with adults. Our own past deviant behavior is the best predictor of our future behavior. The next best predictor is our peers. So peer groups provide the first of opportunities for us for deviant behavior, especially minor deviant behavior, alcohol use, drug use, but certainly more serious behavior as well. This influence is most notable in our teen years. We're sort of pulling away from our parents during that time period, but we're not completely independent, spending a lot of time with our friends. We don't completely understand how this works, but some things involve, think about how much more likely you are to engage in, make bad choices when you're with a peer group, right? So some of it is we don't want to be made fun of for not engaging in the behavior. If we're in a group, it sort of dilutes everybody's responsibility. Longitudinal research also finds strong support for social learning. Basically, the balance of how many delinquent friends you have versus non-delinquent friends. The more delinquent friends you have, the greater likelihood of becoming delinquent. People who only have delinquent friends are twice as likely to be delinquent. This is a strong relationship, even when you take into account other things that might impact that. Gangs is a small portion of group-related delinquency. Research does find a big influence here, between gang membership and serious delinquency. That sort of makes sense. Membership in a gang is delinquent behavior to begin with. Even people who just sort of marginally associate with gang members, even if they're not officially gang members themselves, are also at higher risk. So having delinquent friends produces more frequent, more intense, more enduring associations with them, exposes you to delinquent role models and definitions, and this is a group who's going to reinforce your bad behavior. So this is just an extension of how delinquent peers influence you, right? This can also be explained by social learning. Aker has done some extensive research on social learning in conjunction with other people. They find that differential association, reinforcement, imitation, and definition are strongly related to deviance, both as individual variables and when you combine them together, and that they're stronger than some other theoretical models. So when they look at these variables and how they impact drug abuse and use, it accounts for anywhere from 30 to 68% of the variance. What that means is Some studies have found as little as 31%. Some studies have found it explains nearly 70% of the difference between why some people engage in drug use and abuse and why some don't. For comparison, social bonds accounts for about 15% and enemy for less than 5%. So something that can explain even 30% of the variance in criminal behavior is a pretty strong theory. They've looked at teen smoking, and these theories predict this pretty well. It predicts the maintenance of smoking over a 3-year period. It's even better in a 5-year period. It's also explanatory of elderly drinking. It's been used to explain men who use force to gain sex or commit rape. And so, if you look at this, we can see several behaviors they've researched here, and it's been a pretty powerful explanatory factor there. They found some evidence of a relationship between social structure and social learning. Differences in marijuana and alcohol use by teens, drinking by elderly are also mediated by these impacts or these variables. So social structural factors that are related to social learning account for about 65% of the variance in homicide rates as well. There's not enough research yet to show that social learning is the principal process here, playing a role between social structure and crime, but we do see some positive trends here. What about critiques of this, right? So one thing that's been challenged here, and you'll see this with most of the theories, is that this can be a very tautological theory, right? So it can have some circular reasoning. Reinforcement is often defined in a way that makes it true by definition. So reinforcement is defined as when behavior has been strengthened, so the rate of committing a behavior has been increased, right? So if behavior is reinforced, it will be strengthened. If behavior is reinforced, it's reinforced. It's been criticized for the temporal sequence. So, which comes, this big debate about which kind of comes first, the chicken or the egg. Which comes first, associated with delinquent peers or being delinquent? And the problem is these both impact each other. So there's other arguments that say, delinquency causes the delinquent peers or associations with delinquent peers. These criticisms might be off the mark. The tautological problem has been identified, and they've separated definitions of reinforcement from other concepts. And they've proposed some criteria that would allow you to potentially prove these concepts wrong. Theory can be falsified, and that's the thing. In order to prove a theory, you have to also be able to prove it wrong. It's typically the theory can be falsified. Typically the case that positive social approval or other rewards most often reduce rather than increase. Delinquent behavior may precede the association with delinquent peers, but that doesn't necessarily contradict this theory. It would contradict it if research showed that onset most often predates interaction with delinquent peers. It would not support the theory if research showed the level of delinquency preceding association stayed the same or decreased. And research has not found that to be true yet. Studies favor the process proposed by social learning. They recognize both direct and reciprocal effects. So kids associate differentially with peers who are deviant. They learn definitions favorable to deviance. They're exposed to deviant models, and then that initiates or increases their deviant behavior. So feathering and flocking are sort of similar. It's a unified process. So we get introduced to maybe minor delinquent behavior by some peers. We engage in that, and then we might start to associate with more delinquent peers. Some other criticisms include that there's a strong relationship between self-reported delinquency and friends is due to the fact that associations are often measured by self-report. So how do the kids describe their own behavior? Whether or not we can generalize this theory to a lot of behavior has yet to be fully demonstrated. So it's been explanatory for tobacco, alcohol, drug use, minor deviance. So we need some more empirical evidence here. How do we apply this in some prevention and treatment programs? It's possible then to modify criminal behavior by manipulating the process in which behavior is learned. And so this is sort of what happens with most treatment programs. So you can see your book is going to talk about a couple of different programs here and the impacts that they have had on how they relate to social learning theory and whether or not these programs are successful. So also a lot of these programs are dated. So one of these is from 1958, right? Boys went to school, work, and other day, and they lived in a residential facility at night. The principal activity they engaged in was called guided group interaction. So these were basically like peer groups for counseling, where they would discuss common problems and talk about pro-social ways to resolve them. At the end of the program, boys developed attitudes more favorable to law-abiding behavior, but the changes were not great. It wasn't a very strong effect. It was most impactful amongst Black youth. Provo and Silverlake engaged in some semi-residential alternatives as opposed to regular probation. This draws on, again, social learning theory, and they wanted to cultivate a pro-social peer culture. So boys had the responsibility and authority to form groups, orient new people who were being admitted to the program, set standards and rules, determine punishments, and decide when someone was ready for release. They were supposed to have random assignment of court-adjudicated youth, but the design did not last. The judge heard of strong positive effects and began sending more people to the program. But in order to accurately assess this, we need to know that there are similar people receiving each of the different types of treatments. They did have a lower recidivism rate, and this held true 4 years later. Eventually, they ran out of funding, and the county did not continue the funding, and the program ended. There was a teaching family model where married couples and about 6 to 8 kids lived together as a family, so sort of like a foster home or a group home. They would earn reward points for proper behavior and loss points for improper behavior. It does work to maintain good behavior at home and in school while living within the family. But once they were released from the program and they were no longer in that supportive environment, those impacts disappeared. Oregon did this program that was like a coercive family model. They proposed that children's behavior and interactions with others are learned in the family, and that carries into some other arenas in which children are interacting. So they engaged in this adolescent transition program where they targeted family management skills. So they had parent groups where the parents met with a therapist and developed some better parenting skills. The teens who were at risk were in both group and individual counseling. We did see some improvements in parenting skills here and some reductions in antisocial behavior. So intervention groups with older teens, however, can increase some deviant behavior. There was a multi-dimensional treatment foster care program. People were assigned to a foster care family when their own family is incapable of caring for them properly. They used a 3-point level system that connected and helped the children, the foster children, earn privileges. The idea here was the parents were supposed to notice and reinforce positive behavior. Kids also engaged in weekly therapy sessions, and after the program ended, they returned home. There were lower rates of both official and self-reported delinquency. There were fewer arrests and self-reported delinquency 1 year post-release, and that continued up to 3 years later. As you can see, most of these programs are pretty similar. The LIFT program, they wanted to target high-risk communities and use a universal strategy. So they used 1st and 5th graders because those were sort of transitional years for kids. There was some classroom-based problem-solving training, playground-based behavior modification, and parent training. The parents basically went through 6 weekly sessions. They also, where they would sort of develop better parenting skills. There were some classroom interventions as well, and they used a video monitoring system for daily communication between parents and teachers. A voicemail system. There were modest to strong effects immediately on reducing physical aggression. By the time the 5th graders were in middle school and early high school, they had significantly fewer police arrests, lower level of drug use. Pressy proposed that treatment in reform groups are based on differential association. Pressy also proposed that these effects come from retroflexive reformation. So offenders affect their own balance of definitions more than they affect someone else's balance of definitions. So when they agree to participate in this group, they accept the pro-social purpose and alienate themselves from antisocial people. This has 3 major principles. Contingency, which involves differential association and reinforcement in groups, quality of interpersonal relationships, and a program of self-monitoring and self-reinforcement. Manipulation of the associations and reinforcers did produce significant changes. The better skilled the volunteers were, the more likely the inmates were to develop pro-social attitudes. Adult probationers did develop a greater respect for the law and were at lower risk to reoffend. So they did appear to change their attitudes, and they have lower recidivism rates than similar prisoners. Andrew has a more fully developed TICR model where he looked at relationship principles and contingency principles. Andrew also conducted a meta-analysis. So again, this is where you go back and you review a whole series of studies and found that using families and peers are the most effective approaches. Cognitive behavioral approaches and social learning approaches are also most effective. I'm going to skip over talking about grades because this is like D.A.T except for gangs, and it's not particularly effective. Alcohol and drug education, D.A.T is designed to sort of do this, right? Research tells us they do have more knowledge about drugs and alcohol, but it doesn't really impact reduction and prevention. These are also programs that are most effective when they're not run by law enforcement. So what works? With high-risk youth, programs that rely on cognitive behavioral approaches. So this is where we're talking about people's thinking patterns and their behavior, and using behavior modification. Community and school-based programs draw upon both social learning and social bonds. So Head Start, for example.